You ever hear the sound of your own property telling you to stay out? The hiss came first, sharp and sudden, like air escaping a punctured lung, followed by that slow grinding crunch under my tires as I rolled to a stop halfway up the gravel road I'd driven 100 times before. The smell hit next, hot rubber and dust mixing in the late afternoon heat. And for a second, I just sat there gripping the wheel, staring through my windshield at something that didn't belong. Bright strips of metal teeth stretched across my road, catching the sun in jagged flashes. Bolted down like they'd always been there. Except they hadn't. This was my cabin road, my grandfather's land, 47 acres of quiet pine and red dirt tucked just outside county lines where nobody bothered you unless you invited them. I killed the engine and stepped out, boots crunching slower now, more careful, the air carrying that faint metallic tang you don't expect to smell in the middle of the woods. That's when I saw the sign. Clean, white, freshly planted like a flag in Concord. Ground. HOA controlled access. No entry. I actually laughed, just once, short and dry, because it didn't make sense. There was no HOA out here, not on this stretch, not on land my family had held since before most of these subdivisions even existed. My name is Ethan Cole, and that cabin sitting a quarter-mile up this road isn't just some weekend getaway. It's where I learned how to fix a fence, how to read a survey line, how to respect property the way my grandfather did, like it meant something. And now there were spike strips chewing into my tires and a sign telling me I didn't belong. I walked the rest of the way up, slower, noticing details I shouldn't have had to notice. New tire tracks cutting deeper into the dirt, trimmed branches along the edge like someone had been maintaining it, controlling it. Then I saw him, standing near the cabin porch like he'd been expecting me, hands on his hips, posture relaxed in a way that only comes from thinking you're completely in the right. Richard Halvorson, moved in down the ridge a few months back, the kind of guy who wore pressed polos in places where people usually wore work boots, always talking about improvements and community standards like he was running a board meeting instead of living in the middle of nowhere. He gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can't drive up here anymore," he said, voice smooth, like we were discussing parking at a grocery store instead of my land. I glanced back down at the road, at the strips that had just shredded two perfectly good tires, then back at him. "This is my access road," I said, keeping my voice level, feeling that slow, steady pressure building in my chest. Not anger, not yet, just awareness. He shrugged, casual, almost bored. "Not anymore. HOA voted to annex this section for controlled access. Liability issue," he added, like that explained everything. The word annex hung in the air heavier than it should have, like it had weight behind it, like paperwork had already been filed somewhere I hadn't seen yet. I looked past him at the cabin, the same wood siding, the same porch railing. My grandfather had replaced with his own hands, and for the first time since I'd pulled up, something shifted. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had made a move, and those spike strips back there, they weren't just to stop a car. They were a message. What he didn't know, standing there with that confident little smile, was that every inch of that road, every boundary line, every right of access tied to this land. I knew it better than he ever could, and the sound. Those strips made under my tires, that sharp metallic hiss, it wasn't the end of anything, it was the beginning. I did not argue with him, not right away, because arguing only works when both sides are dealing in the same reality, and standing there looking at that sign, at those metal strips biting into my road, I could already tell Richard was operating on a different set of rules. I walked past him without asking permission, up the short set of wooden steps that still creaked the same way they had 20 years ago, each board flexing under my weight like it recognized me, like it was reminding me that I belonged here whether anyone else agreed or not. The cabin door was unlocked, which was wrong. I always kept it secured, not out of fear, but out of respect for the place. And when I pushed it open, the smell hit me instantly. Not pine and old wood and dust like it should have been, but something cleaner, artificial, like fresh paint and new furniture. He had been inside. My boots tracked a thin line of dirt across a floor that had been swept too recently. Chairs moved. A new rug thrown down where my grandfather's old coffee table used to sit. And for a moment, I just stood there, taking it in, letting the details settle instead of reacting to them. Because details matter more than emotion when something like this happens. We improved it. Richard called from behind me, his voice carrying that same calm confidence, like he was giving me a tour of something he owned. I turned slowly, leaning one hand against the doorframe, feeling the worn groove in the wood where years of use had smoothed it out. Something he would never even notice. "You improved my cabin," I said, keeping my voice even, measuring each word. He smiled again, smaller this time, like he was explaining something simple to someone who just did not get it. "The association voted to bring this section up to standard. You were not maintaining it to community expectations," he said. And there it was again, that word, association, used like it had authority out here where it had none. I stepped back outside, letting the door rest open behind me, and looked past him toward the tree line, toward the faint markers I knew were still there even if you could not see them from 10 feet away. Old survey stakes my grandfather had insisted on placing properly, not guessing, not eyeballing, but measuring, recording, filing. "Show me the boundary," I said. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and that was enough. "It has all been documented," he replied, a little quicker now, a little sharper, like he wanted to move past that part. I nodded, slow, absorbing that shift, because confidence that cracks even slightly usually means there is something underneath it. I walked back down toward the road, past the spike strips, crouching just enough to look closer, noticing the bolts, the placement, the way they had been installed directly over the packed center line where tires naturally track, not random, not temporary, intentional. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, wide shots first, then closer, capturing angles, shadows, details that would matter later even if they seemed small now. Richard let out a short breath behind me, impatient. "You can take all the photos you want," he said. "It does not change anything." I straightened up, slipping my phone back into my pocket, and looked at him again. Really looked this time, at the way he stood, the way he held his ground like it had already been won. "You are right," I said quietly, brushing dust from my hands. "It does not change anything." What I did not say, what he could not hear yet, was that nothing he had put in place out here changed what was already written long before he showed up. And as I glanced once more at those metal strips catching the last light of the day, I realized something else just as clearly. He thought he had blocked access, but what he had actually done was leave evidence, and evidence has a way of opening doors no sign can close. I did not drive back down that road, not with 2 shredded tires and not with him standing there thinking he had already won. So I left the truck where it sat and walked the half-mile out to the county road, the late sun dipping low enough to stretch the shadows long and thin across the dirt, the air cooling just enough to carry the scent of pine and dry grass. And with every step the situation settled into something clearer, something more structured, like a set of plans unfolding instead of a problem spiraling. By the time I reached my phone's signal again, I was not angry anymore. I was focused. The first call I made was not to a lawyer, not yet. It was to the county clerk's office, the same number I had used years ago when I helped my grandfather update the property records after a boundary adjustment. And the woman on the other end answered with that familiar tone of someone who has seen every kind of land dispute there is. I gave her my name, the parcel number, and asked a simple question: "Has anything changed on record in the last 90 days?" And I could hear the keyboard clicks through the line, steady, methodical, the kind of sound that means facts are about to speak. "No changes filed," she said after a moment. "Same ownership, same easement access, nothing new recorded." And that was all I needed to hear. I thanked her, hung up, and stood there for a second listening to the quiet around me. The distant hum of a truck passing on the highway miles away, the wind moving through the trees like nothing had happened, because legally, nothing had. Everything Richard had done was surface level, visible, physical, but not backed by anything that mattered where it counted. I made a second call, this time to a towing company I had worked with on a construction project a few years back. A guy named Frank who understood roads, access, and what it meant when something blocked them. I explained the situation in simple terms. A private access road obstructed by installed hazards, and there was a pause on the line before he let out a low whistle. "That is not something you just throw down," he said. "You got photos," and I told him I did. "Good," he replied. "Keep them. Do not touch anything yet." And that lined up exactly with what I was already thinking. You do not fix a problem like this by removing it. You fix it by documenting it. I hit the county website next, pulling up the GIS map, Zooming in on the parcel boundaries, tracing the lines I already knew by memory but needed to see. In black and white again, the thin lines marking ownership, the thicker notation showing the recorded easement running straight through that road Richard had just claimed. It was still there, clear as day, untouched, unchanged. I zoomed out further, noticing something I had not paid attention to before: several parcels beyond mine that depended on that same access line, landlocked without it, which meant this was not just about me anymore. I leaned back against the hood of my truck where I had parked along the county road, the metal still warm from the day's heat, and let that detail settle in, because it changed the scale of everything. Richard thought he had taken control of one cabin, one stretch of dirt road, but what he had actually done was interfere with a legally protected access that multiple property owners depended on, and that kind of mistake does not stay small for long. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through the photos I had taken, the angles, the bolts, the sign, each one sharper now that I knew exactly what I was looking at. And for the first time since I heard that tire give out under me, I felt something close to certainty. He had made it obvious, permanent, undeniable. And as the light faded and the air cooled further, I realized the clock had already started, not for me, but for him, because once something like this is seen clearly, it does not take long for the right people to see it too. The next morning started with the sound of gravel shifting under tires that were not mine, slow and deliberate, like someone testing ground they thought they owned. And when I stepped out of the small rental truck I had picked up before sunrise, the air was colder, sharper, carrying that early morning stillness that makes every noise feel louder than it should be. My original truck was still sitting halfway up the road where I had left it, slightly angled, one tire completely flattened, the rubber curled at the edges where it had been torn, and those same metal strips were still there, untouched, catching the pale light like they were proud of what they had done. I walked up to them again, slower this time, crouching just enough to run my eyes along the placement. The bolts drilled clean into the compacted center line, spaced evenly, installed with intent, not something temporary, not something accidental. I took more photos, different angles, closer detail, making sure every inch of it was documented, because evidence does not care how you feel. It only cares how clearly you can show it. Behind me, I heard the faint hum of an engine idling, and when I turned, Richard was there again, leaning casually against the side of a dark SUV. Coffee cup in hand like this was just another normal morning. "You are persistent," he said, taking a slow sip, watching me like I was the one out of place. I straightened up, brushing dirt from my hands, letting a few seconds pass before answering, not because I needed to think, but because silence makes people fill in gaps with their own assumptions. "I like to understand things before I act," I said, keeping my voice level, measured, the same tone I used on job sites when something did not add up. He smiled slightly, but it did not hold, not fully, because there was a flicker there now, a small uncertainty that had not been there yesterday. "There is nothing to understand," he replied, a little quicker than before. "The association has jurisdiction now. This access is controlled for safety reasons." And he gestured loosely toward the strips, like they were some kind of reasonable solution. I nodded once, glancing past him toward the trees, toward the invisible lines that had not moved no matter what he said, then back to him. "You filed that with the county?" I asked, not a question, more like placing a piece on a board. He hesitated again, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. "Is being handled," he said, choosing his words carefully this time. And that was all the answer I needed. I reached into the truck and pulled out a folder, thick, worn at the edges, the kind of folder that has been opened and closed more times than you can count, and flipped it open just enough to glance at the top page, not to show him, but to remind myself what was already there, recorded, stamped, unchanging. The original easement documentation, dated, filed, acknowledged, not something that could be overridden by a sign and a set of metal strips. I closed the folder again and set it back on the seat, not making a show of it, just letting the moment sit. "You should probably remove those," I said finally, nodding toward the strips, my tone still calm, almost casual, like I was giving advice instead of a warning. He let out a short breath through his nose, something between a laugh and dismissal, and shook his head. "That is not happening," he said, more firmly now, doubling down. Because people rarely step back once they have committed this far. I studied him for a second longer, the way his grip tightened slightly around the coffee cup, the way his stance shifted just a fraction, and then I nodded again, slow, accepting, because sometimes the best move is letting someone stay exactly where they are. All right, I said, turning back toward the road, toward my disabled truck and the strips that had caused it. Then we will let the right people take a look at it. And as I walked past the metal teeth once more, the early sunlight catching along their edges, I knew this was the last time I would be looking at them as an obstacle, because the moment they had been installed, they stopped being his control and started becoming my leverage. By noon the air had warmed enough to pull the scent of dust and pine sap up from the ground, and I was back in town sitting across from a desk that had seen more disputes than most people ever would. The surface worn smooth where papers had been slid back and forth for decades, and behind it sat a man named Carl Bennett, county enforcement officer, the kind of guy who did not waste words and did not get impressed easily. I laid my phone down first, screen lit, and slid it toward him without saying anything, letting the photos speak before I did. Wide shots of the road, close shots of the bolts, the sign, the placement, every detail captured clean and clear. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing just enough as he scrolled. The only sound in the room the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft tap of his finger moving from one image to the next. That your access road? He asked finally, not looking up yet. Recorded easement, I replied, sliding the folder across the desk next, opening it to the stamped pages that had been filed long before either of us had this conversation. He glanced at the documents, then back at the photos, then finally leaned back in his chair with a slow exhale that said more than words would have. He put those in himself, he said, not a question this time. Yesterday, I answered. He shook his head once, small, controlled, like he had seen this pattern before. People think if they act first, they can make it real, he muttered. More to himself than to me. Then reached for his phone and dialed a number without hesitation. I sat there listening to his side of the conversation, short, direct, no wasted language, referencing parcel numbers, recorded access, obstruction, and something about immediate inspection. When he hung up, he looked at me again, this time differently, not as someone bringing in a complaint, but as someone who had already brought in proof. Do not remove anything, he said, tapping the screen of my phone lightly. Leave it exactly how it is, I nodded, because that had been the plan from the start. We will take a look this afternoon, he added, already reaching for a clipboard. Already moving on to the next step. Like this was just another piece of a process that always ended the same way when the facts were clear. I left the office with that same steady feeling I had found the night before. Not relief, not yet, but alignment, like everything was starting to fall into place exactly where it should have been all along. By the time I got back out to the county road, the sun was high and bright, the heat pressing down just enough to make the metal on my truck warm to the touch as I leaned against it. Waiting. It did not take long. The low rumble of a county vehicle rolled in from the distance, tires kicking up a thin trail of dust as it turned onto the access, slowing as it approached the strips, stopping just short of them like the road itself had drawn a line. Carl stepped out, hat pulled low, clipboard in hand, and took in the scene in one long, quiet look, eyes moving from the sign to the metal, strips to my disabled truck and back again. He crouched near the bolts, running a hand just above them without touching, studying the placement, the installation, the intent. Richard appeared a minute later, walking down from the cabin with that same measured confidence, but it did not sit the same anymore, not with someone official standing there writing things down. Is there a problem? Richard asked, voice controlled but tighter than before. Carl did not answer right away, just finished his notes, then stood up slowly, turning to face him with a calm that did not need to be raised to carry weight. We are going to sort that out, he said evenly, glancing once more at the strips, then at the sign, then back at Richard. And in that moment, with the sun reflecting off the metal and the quiet settling heavy around us, it was clear that whatever control had been claimed here yesterday was already starting to slip, not because of anything loud or dramatic, but because the right set of eyes had finally seen exactly what had been done. The shift happened quietly, the kind of shift you only notice if you are paying attention, and I was, standing there with the sun high overhead, watching Carl finish his inspection while Richard stood just a few feet away trying to hold on to something that was already slipping. Carl flipped a page on his clipboard, the sound of paper sharp in the still air, then looked directly at Richard with a steady expression that did not invite argument. "This access is recorded," he said, tapping the board lightly with his pen. "And it serves multiple parcels, not just his." And he nodded once in my direction without needing to say my name. Richard's jaw tightened just slightly, the kind of small movement people make when they realize the conversation is no longer going their way. "The association has jurisdiction over safety measures," he replied, trying to regain ground. But his tone was different now, less certain, like he was repeating something instead of owning it. Carl did not raise his voice, did not step forward, did not need to do anything dramatic. He just shook his head once, slow and controlled. "You do not have the authority to obstruct a recorded easement," he said, each word clear, measured, leaving no space for interpretation. "And installing hazards like this creates liability, not control." The word liability hung in the air longer than anything else, heavier, more real than all the language Richard had been using since this started. I watched it land, watched. The way Richard shifted his weight, the way his grip tightened around his phone now instead of a coffee cup, like he was already thinking about who he needed to call. Carl stepped closer to the strips, crouching again, this time pointing directly at the bolts. "These were installed intentionally," he added, almost like he was documenting it out loud. "This is not a temporary barrier. This is a fixed obstruction." And he wrote something down, the pen moving steadily across the page. I leaned back slightly against my truck, arms relaxed, letting the scene play out without interrupting, because this was the part where facts did the work. Richard glanced at me then, quick, sharp, like he was trying to read something, maybe expecting a reaction, maybe hoping for one, but I gave him nothing, just met his look evenly, and then looked away, back toward the road, back toward the line that had not moved no matter what he had tried to claim. "You need to remove these immediately," Carl said finally, standing back up, his tone still calm, but carrying something firmer underneath it now. Something official. Richard hesitated, and this time it was longer, enough to feel, enough to show. "We will review this with our legal team," he said, defaulting to distance, to delay, to anything that bought time. Carl nodded once, like he had expected that answer. "You can do that," he replied. "But as of now, this is documented as an unlawful obstruction." And he tapped the clipboard again, a small gesture that somehow felt final. The wind picked up just enough to move through the trees, a low rustling sound that filled the silence between them, and I could feel it then, that subtle but undeniable shift, the moment where control changes hands not with force, but with clarity. Richard had built something visible, something he thought would hold, but it was already being reduced to lines on a report, to evidence, to a problem that had to be corrected. And as Carl walked back toward his vehicle, already reaching for his radio, I knew this was no longer a question of who claimed the land. It was a matter of how fast the system would catch up to what had already been proven. The county vehicle disappeared down the road in a slow trail of dust, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, heavier, more defined, like something had just been set in motion that could not be undone, and I stayed where I was for a moment, watching the last of that dust settle over the metal strips still bolted into my road, knowing they would not be there much longer, but also knowing they had already done their job. Richard did not move right away either, standing near the edge of the clearing with his phone in his hand, staring at the ground like he was trying to calculate something that no longer added up. The confidence he had carried the day before was thinner now, stretched, and when he finally looked up at me, there was a different question in his eyes. Not "what are you going to do?" but "what is already happening?" "This is not over," he said. But the words landed softer than he probably intended, more like a statement he was trying to convince himself of than something directed at me. I nodded once, not disagreeing, not agreeing, just acknowledging the obvious, because he was right about one thing. It was not over, but not in the way he thought. "No, it is not," I said, my voice steady. Then I turned and walked back toward the cabin without waiting for anything else, because there was nothing left to say out here that would change what was already in motion. Inside, the air still carried that same artificial scent, that faint trace of someone trying to overwrite something that had been there longer, and I moved through the space slowly, taking in every detail again, not out of attachment this time, but out of clarity, documenting it in my mind the same way I had documented the road. The shifted furniture, the new rug, the small changes that told a bigger story, that someone had not just stepped over a line but tried to redraw it entirely. I opened a drawer near the kitchen, the old hinges creaking in a familiar rhythm, and found what I expected, the original spare key still tucked in the back corner where my grandfather had always kept it, untouched, unnoticed, a small reminder that not everything can be replaced just by showing up and claiming it. I stepped back outside and pulled my phone out again, not to take more pictures this time, but to make calls. Different ones now, ones that extended beyond a single office or a single report. I pulled up the parcel map again, zoomed out to those neighboring lots that depended on this same access, and started making a list, names tied to land, land tied to rights. Rights that had just been interfered with. The first call was to a man named Daniel Pierce, owner of the parcel 2 lots behind mine. Someone I had met once years ago when we both happened to be out here at the same time. And when he answered, his voice carried that cautious tone of someone who does not expect calls like this. I explained it simply, the obstruction, the access, the inspection already logged, and there was a pause on the line before he let out a low breath. That is the only road in, he said, and I could hear the realization settling in on his end just as clearly as it had on mine. Exactly, I replied. By the time I ended that call and moved to the next name on the list, the pattern was already forming, each conversation building on the last, each person understanding the same thing from a slightly different angle, that this was not just one dispute. It was a shared problem with a shared solution. I leaned against the porch railing, the wood warm under my hands, and looked out toward the road again, toward the place where those strips still sat, quiet and unmoving. And for the first time since this started, I saw them for what they really were, not a barrier, not a threat, but a trigger, something that had set off a chain reaction Richard had never planned for, because he thought he was dealing with one person, one property, one line, and what he had actually done was pull on something much larger, something that was already tightening around him with every call I made. By late afternoon, the air had shifted again, the kind of quiet tension you feel before something breaks, and I could hear it before I saw it. Engines coming in from different directions, not fast, not chaotic, but steady, purposeful, like people who had decided to show up instead of wait. The first truck rolled in slow behind mine, tires stopping just short of the metal strips, and Daniel stepped out, scanning the road, the sign, the placement, his expression tightening as the reality matched what I had told him over the phone. That blocks everything, he said under his breath, more to himself than to me, and I nodded once, because that was the point. Another vehicle followed. Then another, each one stopping at the same invisible line. Each person stepping out with that same look, that same moment of understanding when they realized this was not just a story, not just a complaint, but something physically in place, something that affected them directly. The road filled with presence, not loud, not aggressive, just undeniable. A line of people standing at the edge of something that had been claimed without their consent. Richard came down from the cabin again, faster. This time, his steps less measured, his posture tighter, and when he saw more than just me standing there, something in his expression shifted completely, the confidence gone, replaced by something closer to urgency. "You cannot just bring people here," he said, voice raised just enough to carry, trying to re-establish control through volume, but it did not land the way he expected. Daniel stepped forward slightly, not confrontational, just direct. "This is the only access to my property," he said, his tone calm but firm, and that statement carried more weight than anything louder could have. Carl's vehicle returned shortly after, pulling up alongside the others, dust settling slowly around the scene as he stepped out again, clipboard still in hand, but now with additional paperwork tucked under his arm. He took in the gathered group, the blocked road, the strips, the sign, and gave a small nod, like everything he needed to see had already confirmed what was written. "Multiple affected parcels," he said, almost like he was updating his own notes out loud, then looked directly at Richard. "This is now a broader access obstruction," and there was no room left in his tone for interpretation or delay. Richard opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. the words catching somewhere between intention and reality, because the situation had grown beyond anything he could frame as a simple dispute. Carl handed him a document, the paper crisp, official, and even from where I stood I could see the bold heading across the top, the kind that does not ask, it instructs. You are required to remove these obstructions immediately and restore access, Carl said, his voice even, steady, but final. Failure to comply will result in further enforcement action. The wind moved through the trees again, carrying the dry scent of the ground and the faint metallic smell from the strips. And for a moment, everything held still, like the entire scene was waiting for a response that no longer mattered. Richard looked down at the paper, then back at the road, then at the line of people standing there. And whatever calculation he had been holding on to finally gave way. He did not argue this time, did not push back, did not try to explain, because there was nothing left to explain. I watched as he stepped toward the strips, slower now, each movement deliberate. And for the first time since this started, he looked at them the same way I had, not as control, not as authority, but as something that should never have been there in the first place. And as the late sun caught along the edges of that metal one more time, I knew the shift was complete, not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable. The kind of change that happens when the truth finally stands where everyone can see it. By the next morning the road looked different, not because the dirt had changed or the trees had moved, but because the illusion that had been built there was gone, stripped away piece by piece until only what was real remained. The metal strips were gone, the bolts pulled clean, leaving small dark marks in the packed earth where they had been forced in, and the sign that had once stood at the entrance was no longer there either. Just a faint rectangle in the soil where it had been planted, like a claim that never held. My truck sat where I had left it, but now it was being loaded carefully onto a flatbed, the chains clinking softly in the morning air as Frank guided it into place with the kind of precision that comes from years of doing things the right way the first time. I stood a few feet back, hands in my pockets, watching it all with a calm that had settled in overnight. Not excitement, not relief. Just a quiet certainty that everything had unfolded exactly the way it was supposed to. Richard was there too, but not the same way he had been before, not standing at the center, not directing anything, just off to the side, talking quietly with someone in a pressed shirt who kept glancing at the paperwork Carl had handed over the day before. There was no confidence left in his posture, no easy smile, just a tight, controlled focus on something that had clearly moved beyond his control. Carl arrived again shortly after, stepping out of his vehicle with that same steady presence, clipboard in hand. But this time there was a finality to his movements, like the last steps of a process that had already reached its conclusion. He walked the length of the access road slowly, eyes scanning the ground, the cleared path, the absence of anything that should not be there, and then he stopped near me, giving a small nod that said more than any explanation needed to. Access is restored, he said simply, marking something down on his page. And those 3 words carried the weight of everything that had happened over the last 48 hours. I nodded back, looking past him toward the cabin, the porch catching the early light just the way it always had, unchanged beneath everything that had tried to cover it. The door was open again, not forced, not claimed, just open the way it should have been, and the air drifting out carried that familiar mix of wood and time that no fresh paint could replace. Behind us, I heard the low murmur of voices, the quiet exchange of information that happens when things move from confrontation to resolution, and when I glanced back, I saw Richard being handed another document, thicker this time, more formal, the kind that does not suggest next steps but outlines consequences. He took it without argument, without protest, just a short nod, like he understood now that this was no longer something he could shape. I did not need to hear what was said, did not need to step closer, because the outcome was already clear in the way everything had shifted, in the absence of what had been there before, in the presence of the people who had come and gone with purpose. I walked back up the road slowly, boots pressing into the same dirt that had been there long before any of this started, and stopped at the edge of the porch, resting my hand against the railing where the wood dipped slightly from years of use. For a moment, I just stood there, listening to the quiet settle back into place, the wind moving through the trees, the distant hum of a truck on the highway miles away. The normal sounds returning like nothing had ever been interrupted. What he had built had lasted less than 2 days. And in that time, he had exposed everything he did not understand about ownership, about law, about the difference between claiming something and actually having the right to it. I stepped inside, letting the screen door close behind me with that soft, familiar click, and as the light shifted across the floor, I realized something that had been true from the beginning, something that did not need to be said out loud to be understood. Justice does not arrive with noise or force. It does not need to. It moves through records, through evidence, through patience. And when it finally shows up, it does exactly what it is supposed to do, nothing more, nothing less, and it always leaves things the way they were meant to be.